Hello, and welcome to episode 565 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. I'm David Barr Kirtley, author of the book Save Me, Please, and Other Stories. Publishers Weekly says, visceral settings and robust characters will have readers marveling at how much Kirtley is able to fit into a limited page count. For SFF fans with no time to sink into a doorstopper, these concentrated doses of genre goodness will hit the spot. And Kirkus Reviews writes, Kirtley employs sharp, concise prose that complements his puckish sense of humor. The author's passionate voice breathes life into this wonderful array of tales. So again, the book is called Save Me, Please, and Other Stories, and it's available now on Amazon.com. And our guest today is David Sirota. He's the editor of the political news site The Lever, and his writing has appeared in Jacobin Magazine and The Guardian. He served as Bernie Sanders' speechwriter during the 2020 presidential campaign, and his podcast Meltdown, about the 2008 financial crisis, was named one of the best podcasts of the year by The Atlantic. And in this interview, we'll be discussing his work on the Netflix movie Don't Look Up, about vacuous elites who ignore the danger of an approaching comet, and his book Back to Our Future, how the 1980s explain the world we live in now, our culture, our politics, our everything. And now here's our interview with David Sirota. All right, so we're here with David Sirota. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so in your book, Back to Our Future, you talk about how as a kid, 80s pop culture was almost like your religion. So tell us about that.
Yeah, so I grew up watching, like everybody, a lot of TV, a lot of movies, and they weren't, they were billed as apolitical, these TV shows, movies. I mean, we're talking about everything from The Cosby Show to Ghostbusters to, you know, all the iconic movies, and they weren't billed as political content. They were considered pop culture, and they were pop culture. But the point of the book that I wrote was that they were obviously sending very political messages to lots and lots of kids, lots and lots of people, and that those political messages ended up reinforcing a set of ideological principles that I think still stay with us today. And we can go into some examples, but I mean, as an example, one easy example is, as I wrote about in the book, the whole story, for instance, you think about the story of Ghostbusters, right? What is the story of Ghostbusters, one of the most famous, iconic movies of the era? Well, the story is that there is a security problem in New York City. The government is inept, can't deal with it, and has to hire a set of private for-profit contractors to fix the problem. And that the real villain in the movie is a guy from the EPA, the bureaucrat, who's overly zealous in enforcing environmental laws. I mean, there's a lot of ideology in there.
Yeah. Well, when you talk about these ideological assumptions, I mean, so the way I would phrase it is, so there was four that I kind of highlighted. So one is that the 50s were an idyllic time, whereas the 60s were violent and chaotic. 2, problems are solved by talented superstars, not by government. 3, the U.S. military is awesome. And 4, racism is a thing of the past. Do you think that's a pretty good summary? Is there anything else?
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot of them. And I think I should add that I think a lot of the military stuff in the 1980s, you know, it was deliberate selling of ideology. There's a really, in my book, there's one of the chapters that I enjoyed writing the most was a chapter about the so-called military entertainment complex. And it was all about how back in the early and mid-1980s, people had really soured on the idea of military adventurism in the aftermath of the Vietnam War. And there were a lot of Vietnam War movies good ones, that rightly lamented the specific decisions to go into Vietnam, et cetera, et cetera. So the military, it wasn't that it wasn't respected. It just it was looked at more with more circumspection by the population than it is today. And so the military realized it had kind of a branding problem. And so the movie Top Gun, as an example, when it came out and it was so popular, and it's obviously a celebration of the military and military adventurism, the Pentagon made a big thing about there were recruiting tables outside of the movie theaters. The Pentagon helped make that movie. So what I'm getting at is that the Pentagon and Hollywood actually forged a very close relationship starting in the 1980s. I mean, there had always been a relationship, but really forged a much closer relationship starting in the 1980s, where the Pentagon was trading access to military hardware, access for filmmakers, as long as the filmmakers would submit their scripts to line editing by the Pentagon, effectively to make the military and military adventurism look good.
Yeah, I mean, and that definitely, out of the many examples in the book, that really seems wrong to me. That these are, these aircraft carriers and jets and everything are public and were paid for by taxpayers, and use of them should not be contingent on having a particular public relations spin or ideology. So I don't know if anyone's working on that, but I mean, but the particular example that struck me the most was you talk about this movie 13 Days about the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the Pentagon complains that the script made the generals look like warmongers, and the studio responds, "Well, here's the White House tapes. We're just taking the dialogue exactly as it happened in history," and even that wasn't good enough to get past the military censors.
I mean, it's an incredible story. That particular story, I'm glad you keyed in on it. It's really an incredible story. This story of how they were trying to make a movie about what happened, and the Pentagon tried to obstruct them because they were telling a story that was factually accurate, that the Pentagon didn't like. It was verifiably, demonstrably accurate. So again, it goes to this relationship between Hollywood studios and the Pentagon, and I want to be clear, that's not a relic. That exists. It's stronger than ever today. It boggles the mind that people are walking into movie theaters or streaming movies in which the Pentagon literally line edited the script, and people are not all that well aware of this, if at all.
Right, and you talk a lot in the book about movies like Red Dawn that had an explicitly intentional right-wing message, but then a lot of these movies, I would imagine, didn't have an intentional message. I mean, Hollywood is sort of famously liberal. I don't know what you think about that, but I mean, it doesn't seem likely to me that, when you're talking about movies like Ghostbusters or Back to the Future, that people were sitting down intentionally, intending to make them shift politics to the right. So kind of, I don't know. Do you agree with that? And if that is the case, how did that happen? That out of like Leftwing Hollywood, you got all this right wing cultural shift in the 80s?
Well, first of all, I actually don't think Hollywood is all that left wing. I mean, so maybe socially liberal, I guess. I don't think it's all that economically lefty or progressive. I don't think on national security issues it is at all. I actually tend to think that Hollywood is like everything, like other industries in America, essentially apolitical. And willing to be mercenary to make as much money as possible. So I agree with you that a lot of what is produced, most of what's produced and has been produced by Hollywood, even back in the 80s, was not designed to. There weren't guys in a smoky room saying, "How do we move people to the right?" I don't think that's what was going on. I think what was more going on was, okay. The political zeitgeist of the moment in the Reagan era, these themes are popular. People are voting for them. Politicians are echoing them. We want to get people into the seats to pay tickets to go see movies. So let's just amplify that more.
I mean, you talk so much in the book about just loving all this stuff as a kid, being such a super fan of all this pop culture. So when did you start looking at something like Ghostbusters or Back to the Future? When did it first occur to you, like, that there might be something that concerned you about movies like that?
To be clear, I still love all this stuff, right? I mean, I'll rewatch Ghostbusters if it's on. I mean, the A-Team has a similar kind of storyline. I mean, I love all this. I get that. I guess what I'm saying is I'm not a I'm not a party pooper here. I love this stuff. It's entertaining. I see the value in it. I think when I got a little older, I started saying, all these stories are.
Are we talking like college, like?
Yeah, probably in college and a little bit beyond. Probably when I first started working on Capitol Hill, I was like, because what you could see is when I started working on Capitol Hill in the late 90s and early 2000s, I remember realizing that a lot of the storylines that I had heard and been exposed to through pop culture growing up, they were being baked into our politics of the time of the late 90s, early 2000s. Especially after 9/11, talking about the militarism and all that. I mean, it all came kind of full circle, and I was like, all this stuff, I think, tends to land. I mean, the government is bad. The individual is the savior. Military might is to be revered. I could go on and on. That all of these themes are landing when politicians say them. They're resonating when politicians say them, in part because a whole generation has been taught them for years and years and years in their brain's most developmentally important period of their lives, when they're kids, when they're growing up, when they're first learning about how to look at the world.
Actually, I really liked this quote. You say, "The human mind is not a vapid DOS prompt waiting to be programmed by pop culture. It's more like a boulder in the middle of a river, anchored, but also slowly sculpted over time by a persistent current." I thought that was a really eloquent way of putting that.
Thank you. And I think that's the way pop culture really works. It's not one television show, right? It's not one episode or one part of a movie. It's just a constant set of stories that we're being told that reinforce a set of worldviews. And I think we have to step back and ask ourselves, where did we learn to think this way? Why did we learn to think this way? And look, I think some things have gotten better since the 1980s. Some things have gotten a lot worse since the 1980s when it comes to what pop culture teaches us. But I think it's important to step back and think, where did I learn to assume, for instance, that the government was bad, bureaucratic, incompetent, can't do anything right. I mean, you could pick out some headline from the news today and say, oh, this government agency didn't do something all that well. But where did you really learn it? Right? I would argue you probably in part learned it when you were a kid watching something like the A-Team or watching something like Ghostbusters. I mean, by the way, the A-Team, I mean, if you really think about the storyline of that, it's incredible, right? I mean, the government is so evil in that show. You have private mercenaries who are having to escape the government to solve the problems that the government won't deal with. And the mercenaries are rewarded with being effectively criminalized by the government. I mean, think about how incredible a story that is. And that really was a child-focused product.
Do you think is there any extent to which you think that kind of right-wing narratives just tap into our mammal, tribal, evolutionary programming in a way that left-wing narratives don't, and that it's just sort of easier, to sell an audience on for example, a story about a vigilante hunting down the criminals who murdered his family, than a story about a sensible, humane criminal justice system rehabilitating a criminal, that there's just something more naturally marketable about a right-wing narrative?
I think there's something to that, but then I also think about previous eras in which different stories were the popular stories. I mean, think about, for instance, the Jimmy Stewart movie, the holiday movie.
It's a Wonderful Life.
It's a Wonderful Life, right? So, It's a Wonderful Life. It's the story of a guy who effectively has a problem with the local banker, right? And it's the whole story about the local banker and the essentially big business is the problem. And this is at a time, of course, this is in the sort of New Deal era, or at least post New Deal era. Point being is that there's always a competition in American politics for who is the central villain. And we have lived through previous eras where the central villain is large accumulations of wealth, oligarchs, plutocrats, big business, et cetera, where that is the central villain of the stories that we tell ourselves. Now, you can certainly argue that maybe those stories go too far, right? But that's a wholly different set of stories we were telling ourselves than the story of actually the real villain is not big business and oligarchs. The real villain is the democratically elected government, right? Like there was a shift there. Now that shift is brought about by a lot of different things, not just Hollywood. Hollywood, I would argue, certainly reflected that shift, amplified it, et cetera. But I don't fully accept the idea that right-wing narratives are somehow inherently more compelling than other kinds of narratives, because I look back on our country's past and know what narratives have been the big narratives that are different from that in our own history.
Mm-hmm. I mean, when you talk about big business being the villain, I certainly feel like I was kind of programmed by Hollywood movies to just see all corporations as evil. I feel like, RoboCop or Aliens, just in almost every science fiction movie I can think of, the corporation is evil. And so I can imagine somebody writing kind of a right-wing equivalent to this, talking about how, Occupy Wall Street was as the result of all these Hollywood movies, telling us that corporations are evil and stuff like that. Do you think that a book like that would be kind of equally valid, just focusing on different things? Or do you think it would just not be valid to look at the past few decades in that frame of reference?
No, I mean, I think there are always anomalies. I mean, obviously, Paul Verhoeven, to my mind, was one of the great dissenters in the 1980s and into the 1990s. You mentioned RoboCop. He's the director, creator of RoboCop. So I think there's always dissenters. Nothing is a full monolith, and I do agree. And James Cameron also. So I think there are examples of what you're talking about. But I also think that the idea of the individual versus the collective really, obviously, in the Reagan era, became the major story that we told ourselves, and it sticks. I really think it sticks with us today. I don't know if we're at a tipping point back. It's really hard to say where we are in our own cultural story, but I do think this idea of whether it's the government, whether it's the community, whether it's I'm using as a proxy the collective. The individual as the most important player in our society, as opposed to the collective, the community, as the most important entity in society. I think that became the dominant political and cultural paradigm in the 1980s. And it's something that we still struggle with today. I think it's at the root of a lot of our problems today, in that it makes it harder for us to act collectively, even though many of the problems we face are a collective action problem.
Can we drill down a little bit on Back to the Future? Because I think if people haven't read the book, it's maybe clear listening to this why Top Gun or something, maybe pushes a pro-America, right-wing, pro-military agenda. But like, could you talk a little bit more about like, why is Back to the Future? What is your concern with a movie like that?
Well, Back to the Future is one of the great movies. I think it's one of the top. I think I've read somewhere it's considered one of the 10 perfect movies ever made. And I love it. I mean, I don't even have to watch that movie on rerun. I can just close my eyes and watch it in my mind. I've seen it so many times. I think the story that was told there, and I don't necessarily have a problem with this story. I just think it's interesting and important to understand what it was telling us. Was here you had a kid in the at that point portrayed as the sort of chaos and decay of the present moment back then, the mid 1980s, who has to flee back into the allegedly idyllic, perfect world of this past halcyon era of the mid 1950s. And so the idealizing the 1950s, I think, is an important thing for us to understand what was being idealized. That this was the safer, better time, allegedly, when America was great. And these themes, I mean, Ronald Reagan really, really, truly ran on these themes. He was just to look at him, he looked like a 1950s figure. I mean, he was an actor, a big actor in the 1950s. So when he was running for president, he kind of personified and physically embodied this idea. And also on the campaign trail was echoing quite literally the "Make America Great" phrase, the idea of restoring America back to a kind of 50s ideal. And that's what Back to the Future, I think that's what a lot of that story really was. And so I think recognizing that, and of course the important part, well, why is that a political message? Well, it's a political message because the 1950s, in a lot of ways, weren't ideal. America, to start with, was essentially an apartheid state in the 1950s, right? I mean, it was Jim Crow era. It was not a perfect country at all.
Let me just read this. This is from the book. I think this sums it up succinctly. It says, lynch mobs, religious bigotry, burning crosses, chauvinism, union busting, and smokestack pollution are all, some of the downsides of the 50s.
Right, but this has been papered over into the ideal that we should want to resurrect. And I think understanding that is at best, a highly political, ideological, selective way to look at the 1950s, that's important. And it identifies for us, wow, we really were being sold something that is political under the sort of guise of it being apolitical. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not taking issue with the filmmakers or the writers. I really do think it is a wonderful movie. It's an amazing comedy. There are a lot of great messages in there. I'm just saying, if we want to understand what we were sold, how we were sold it, without impugning or alleging motives of the filmmakers, that's a good movie to look at and say, hey, what was it selling to us? What was it? What story was it telling us on a deeper level to identify for us the sort of larger issue, which is that whenever we sit down and watch a movie or TV, and whenever your kids are watching movies and TV especially, they are being sold messages. And it's important to be sort of cognizant of that.
Well, I definitely remember in Back to the Future, the scene where he gets back to his own time, to 1985. The streets are covered in trash, and there's a homeless guy sleeping on a bench. And he's like, oh, this is great. I'm back. Everything's so great. And it's such a clear contrast to the clean streets that he just left, that even as a kid, to me, that was, the message that things have regressed since the 50s was explicit. Yeah. Okay, so one thing I'm sort of torn about is that you talk about how cartoons like He-Man and Transformers and Thundercats, stuff like that, were all made possible because the FCC relaxed regulations on basically episode length toy commercials, and but I loved all those shows. So I don't know how to feel. Do you feel like the FCC shouldn't have relax those things, in which case we wouldn't have He-Man and Transformers and Thundercats, or how do you feel about that?
I'm glad you asked this. I've thought a lot about this. I'm not sure if the FCC rules were right, but what we're talking about here is that there were FCC rules that basically said you can't take a toy, essentially a toy commercial, and turn it into a television program. And those FCC rules were removed, which essentially caused a boom in G.I. Joe, Transformers, et cetera, et cetera. And I think, Yeah, at one level you can make an argument that when a kid sits down and watches TV, commercial television, it essentially all is it's all a commercial. At another level, you could say, maybe it's not good that our culture is so focused on commerce and selling things that we're literally trying to sell. We're trying to have television programming that is designed to sell children on something rather than to educate children. I don't know where I come down on that. I can see an argument on both sides. Hey, listen, when your kid watches TV, it's an inherently commercial situation. I can see the other side, which is like, when my kid sits down to watch TV, I especially young kids, preteen kids, I want television to be more educational. I don't want it to be focused on selling them on buying things or selling them political messages. It's a tough question.
Yeah. No, I'm really torn on that. I mean, I guess it's hard to compare because we can't see the alternate history of what TV. We're only looking at the things that we remember and love, and we can't look at the alternate timeline in which there would have been other things, presumably.
Sure. I mean, I think you can compare, though. I think you can compare what Sesame Street or the Electric Company or 3-2-1 Contact was like, or even Mr. Wizard, with what G.I. Joe or the Transformers are doing. Now, look, I love G.I. Joe. I love the Transformers, et cetera, et cetera. But it's doing something different, and it's trying to do something different to the child's brain than Sesame Street, the Electric Company, 3-2-1 Contact. More PBS entertaining but educational television.
Yeah. So I thought it was interesting, this book, Back to Our Future, it has a blurb on the back from Adam McKay. This is back in 2011, the book came out. So I was just curious, how far back do you go with Adam McKay? Did you know him at the time that he blurbed the book?
I did. I met Adam McKay. It was in the Bush era. He had read something that I had written.
Which Bush era?
The George W. Bush era. Okay. So in the 2000s. I had written something, I think it was about NAFTA actually, and he reached out to me, and it was before he had made his kind of pivot in his movies. He sort of pivoted to a different style of movie when he did The Big Short. But so I got to know him a little bit in the Anchorman era. So when I did the book, I was like, oh, he's kind of perfect to blurb the book, and that he does somewhat political stuff. And he actually hustles in a lot of politics through his pop culture products. I mean, Anchorman does have a lot of politics in it, and it's great. And so I thought he would be a really good person to blurb the book.
Mm-hmm. Do you know a lot of people in Hollywood? Is that sort of a scene that you move in, or is it mostly you're commenting on it from the outside?
I've gotten to know more folks in that industry, certainly through getting to know Adam. I mean, Adam McKay is one of my best friends at this point. I also happen to know, I grew up with Adam Goldberg, who is the creator of the ABC show, The Goldbergs. So I have a couple of random contacts in that world. And obviously I worked with Adam McKay on Don't Look Up. But I still feel kind of like an outsider in that world, even though I've done some work in it. I'm always, whenever I go there, I'm typically, when I'm introduced to people, I'm introduced as a journalist.
Mm-hmm. In the acknowledgments, one of the people you thank is Fred Savage. Is that the actor Fred Savage or a different Fred Savage?
Yes, the actor Fred Savage. Yes.
So how do you know him?
I know him a little bit through Adam Goldberg. Adam Goldberg and he have known each other actually for a crazy long time, since they were kids. I think it was in their kids going to the Northwestern Cherub program, which is a program for high school students in acting and writing and such.
So Fred Savage read Back to Our Future in draft, or he?
I think I bounced them. I bounced some ideas off him, or I asked him a few. I think I interviewed him for. It was maybe I interviewed him. I mean, it's a while ago, so I'm remembering I might have interviewed him for part of the research I did on the Wonder Years, which of course the Wonder Years I actually think was one of the more mature shows that actually struggled with, in an honest way, the transition from the 1950s to the 1960s, and did it in a way that wasn't cartoonish at all. I mean, I think there was a lot in the 1980s about how, and you mentioned it before, about how the tropes of the 60s were an out of control, chaotic time, and the left got out of control, and the hippies, et cetera, et cetera. That's how the 60s were basically portrayed in a lot of pop culture products in the 1980s. But I think the Wonder Years was kind of anomalous in that it had a more nuanced view of that. It really presented, and by the way, it was a show for families and with a young an audience of teenagers and the like. And I think it actually took it a lot more seriously. It didn't really just put forward tropes.
If anyone listening doesn't know Fred Savage by name, he's the little kid in the Frame story in The Princess Bride. I'm sure everyone listening to this has seen that. So no, that's really cool, though. Okay, so you mentioned that you sort of worked with Adam McKay on Don't Look Up. So kind of what was the initial inspiration for that, or how did that come about in the first place? Yeah,
so I was I think it was the mid 2018. I was working as a journalist. It was before I went to work for Bernie Sanders' 2020 presidential campaign. And I had been writing some stories about climate, and Adam was very focused on climate at that point. And I had said something. At one point it was after he had done the movie Vice, and I said, I think you should do something on climate. And he said, I know, I've been thinking about that. I don't want to do something kind of Mad Max-ish, post-apocalyptic, et cetera. I don't know what the entry point is. And so he and I had been kind of talking it over a lot informally. And at one point I had published some story about a climate issue. And I said, I don't know why these stories don't land, why they don't travel, why they don't go viral, why they don't get more attention. It kind of feels like there's an asteroid headed towards Earth and nobody cares. And a couple of days later, he came back to me and he said, I wonder if there's something there. I wonder if that's the movie idea I've been, sort of trying to find. And so I said, well, let me write something up. I'll write up a way to do this where there's an asteroid headed towards Earth and nobody cares, even though everyone should care, right? Because I think I made some joke about how in the disaster movie, the asteroid heads towards Earth and everyone panics. And it's it's like Armageddon, the world comes together, we're going to stop it. I think it kind of feels like we live in a world where if you're in Armageddon, nobody would care that it was coming. And so I wrote up a treatment and I sent it to him, and off to the races. He called me a couple months later and said, we're really going to do this. I think, and I was, and as I've said, I kind of was like, yeah, right. We're really going to do it. I've heard it. I've heard, we're going to make this, we're going to make that from people in Hollywood all the time. And, 99% of that stuff, it never actually happens. And, with the force of will, and his amazing, screenwriting and directing, it became real.
Yeah, and it's a fantastic movie. I mean, and it's hilarious. I laughed so much watching it. If people you can listen, we did a review of it if anyone's curious. But if anyone listening hasn't seen it, I would definitely recommend checking it out. Are there any sort of highlights, or when you think back on the movie, being made and coming out and everything, are there any highlights or moments that stick out in your mind?
Well, the main highlight is that a lot of the feedback we received was from scientists who basically finally felt seen and heard. And I think that was really important to us, which I think there have been a lot of people who've been working on the climate issue, not just scientists, but but specifically scientists too, who've been working on the climate issue and feel like they've been sounding an alarm and that nobody has been listening to them. And so I think the movie certainly elevated their frustrations, their understandable frustrations. And I think that was psychologically boosting to them. And I hope that if momentarily and hopefully a little bit longer term, it grabbed the viewership by the lapels and said, we have to listen to these people. We can't allow our desire for entertainment and distraction and tribal partisan infighting make us not focus on and support the people who are warning us about scientifically verifiable disasters, top of mind being climate change. So I felt like that was a real highlight to hear that feedback from those people. That's the point of the movie. And obviously the highlight is that it got, what was it, the second largest audience in the history of the world's largest streaming platform, which means a lot of people actually saw the movie. And look, it created a lot of debate. Some people hated it. Some people loved it. Right. And that's what it was for. I mean, sure, at certain points, I was annoyed by some of the criticism. I felt like some of it was in bad faith. I think some of it was just people just honestly didn't like it, and that's fine. But my point is that I'm glad it spurred a conversation. I do think that Don't Look Up, whether you liked it or hated it, I do think it landed. I do think it made an impact. No pun intended.
I mean, are there any lessons that you took away that you could pass on to other writers, filmmakers, et cetera, in terms of making some entertainment product that shifts the political conversation?
Sure. I think one lesson is that I think I'm going to pat ourselves on the back a little bit. I think we did a decent job of not belittling and berating the audience. If you watch the movie carefully, you'll notice that this is not a movie that says the average person is stupid. That's not what our movie does. In fact, our movie, if you look at the quote unquote average workaday people characters in the movie, they know what's going on. They can sense something is wrong. And the heroes, the central heroes, are trying to get the word out. And the villains are the people who have lots and lots of power in media, in the political sphere, obviously. And so my point is, I think the reason that the movie resonated not just with people who consider themselves climate activists or progressives or liberals, and it actually did transcend and resonate with people who were independent, conservatives, et cetera, et cetera. We got a lot of feedback, positive feedback. I think it did that because it didn't belittle people. It didn't belittle the viewership. And so I hope that's one takeaway for people who are in the content creation business is not to shame the average person, shame the viewership. I will say this. I think it's harder and harder to get made movies and TV shows that struggle with the here and now, that struggle with really serious political issues, because I think the makers, the big powers in film and TV are somewhat afraid of doing anything quote unquote political. So it's a caution. One cautionary note is that if you're going to try to make things that are not set in at the distance of history, right, period pieces where it's sort of safe to deal with things, if you're going to try to struggle in your production with the here and now of political controversy, you have to know it's going to be an uphill climb, because the traditional producers, creators, funders of major TV and film products are a little bit skittish about such content.
Yeah. You know, a few months ago, I interviewed Andrew Yang, and he was saying that when he started, he just thought, if I just convince enough people that universal basic income is a good idea, it'll happen. And then he had come to the conclusion that he had sort of, that the conversation had shifted so that a majority of people were in favor of it, but still nothing was happening because the political system is throwing up impediments to it. And I was wondering if you see a similar sort of dynamic with climate change where, you can make these movies that get people talking and shift the conversation and shift public opinion. But as long as the political system is sort of standing in the way of anything, all that public opinion shifting doesn't equate, doesn't lead to actual substantive change.
I mean, I think both things are true. I think that shifting public opinion alone in the short term will not automatically deliver real, concrete, substantive policy change, all in one fell swoop. But I also think that, and we go back to the stories we tell ourselves in movies. I mean, movies present to us stories where one single person saves the day, and that the saving of the day is in one bold action, saving the world. That's not really how real society works. That's how a good story works, but that's not how real society works. The great successes in American history were successes that came about through years and years and years of work by millions and millions of people, all different kinds of work. Part of the work is to change public opinion. Part of the work is to take public opinion and organize it more cohesively around a specific campaign or a specific piece of legislation. So I guess what I'm getting at is that I see Don't Look Up as an example of something that helped hopefully make people more aware of how acute the crisis is, more aware of who we should be listening to, more aware of who the real problem is, and that's not going to singularly change everything. It is participating in the process of change that there need to be many more movies that do that. Then there need to be simultaneously organizing campaigns and political campaigns. That we have to deprogram ourselves from seeing ourselves as singular heroes or expecting that a singular hero will come around and save us. I think when you and look, I know that, and I struggle. I talk about this in Back to Our Future, which is this sort of great man theory of history, right? FDR was the champion of the New Deal, but the New Deal, as an example, was brought about by labor activism and political activism over decades. Martin Luther King was the great leader of the civil rights movement, one of the great leaders of the civil rights movement. But I'm guessing he would say the same thing. He would say, I wasn't singularly responsible for the Voting Rights Act or any of the other triumphs of the civil rights movement, that I participated in the civil rights movement, and the civil rights movement happened over decades with millions of people involved in it. So I guess it's a long way of saying, I think sure, one political campaign from a presidential candidate, one movie is not going to singularly solve everything. The question really is it participating in bringing about the change we ultimately want to see?
Mm-hmm. So I did also want to ask you about your podcast. It's called Lever Time with David Sirota. And one of the episodes I thought was really interesting that I wanted to talk to you about, the title is Billionaires Are Preparing for the Apocalypse and You're Not Invited, with Douglas Rushkoff.
Yeah.
So kind of what sticks out in your mind about that episode, or is there anything you want to say about that interview? Yeah,
I mean, that was a topic I'm fascinated with, which is looking at how at a vision for how we survive the existential crises we face. And that episode was about a group of billionaires who are building bunkers, who are building ways for themselves to, in some cases, get off the planet, move to Mars, et cetera, et cetera. That the inherent vision in that is a vision of every individual for themselves, that you can somehow survive these existential crises alone if you've got enough money or foresight, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm glad it's a good segue because we're talking about the individual versus the collective. And what Doug Rushkoff, the author of a book about this, was saying was that when he was asked to advise a group of very wealthy hedge fund guys they were asking essentially, how do I control the staff in my, apocalypse bunker? He said, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he said something to the effect of, well, the way to control them or get what you want from them is to make them feel part of the governance and the decision-making process and the part of the survival, the community that's surviving, not by, putting, ankle bracelets on them or threatening to withhold food from them. It's not through top-down power. It's actually by making them feel like they're participating at an equal level in a community. And so what I find interesting about this is when you look ahead to the existential crises we face, I think it's fair to say that we as a society are not going to survive these crises in the way we want to survive them unless we actually prioritize the idea that we are all in this together, and that there is no single solution to save yourself individually from a collective problem. I mean, climate change, sure, you can you build a bunker? Yes, you can build a bunker. Will it maybe make things better for you if in the event of an absolute catastrophe, a nuclear war, a climate catastrophe where there's no food or whatever? Sure, you may be able to survive a little bit longer, but you're probably going to have a better experience, and everyone is going to have a better experience if instead you focus your energy on how do we get everyone to work together to avert the crisis rather than everyone scattering, trying to save themselves with the crisis being a foregone conclusion.
Right. So what happens with these billionaires in the book, and as he tells it, is that, they're like, well, we have like Navy SEALs, who are going to fly out and protect us when civilization collapses. And he's kind of like, well, why are the Navy SEALs going to do what you say? And they're like, well, we're paying them. And he's like, okay, but the second civilization collapses, you're not a billionaire anymore. You're just somebody who doesn't know how to shoot and hunt and survive. Like, what's to stop the Navy SEALs from just moving into your bunker and kicking you out or doing whatever they want to do? So
that's absolutely right. And I think I go back to what Rushkoff said, essentially, that in that situation, there's no way to exert quote unquote control. It's a situation that requires us to actually relinquish control, or at least some control, relinquish some power, and work together. And I think, unfortunately, that idea has become a bit alien to American society. It's become It's become something that we're out of practice in at best. I think there's examples where we're getting, as a society, better in practice for that. I mean, you look at some of the recent activism in the labor movement and the like, where workers really are working together, really are making gains. I think you see examples of that working. But I think culturally, that democratic, small d democratic spirit has been on the wane for a while, and it needs to go in the opposite direction. We need to really reinvigorate that now.
And then the other episode I wanted to ask you about, this will probably be the last thing we have time for, but it's called The Scientific Breakthrough That Could End Climate Change with Dr. Arthur Terrell. You describe yourself in this episode as a huge fusion fan. Do you want to talk about, what do you think about this idea of a scientific solution such as fusion power to climate change?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think fusion power is something that, if we can unlock, could be a true game changer. It's not what we need to do to unlock that is actually not a mystery. It's just it's just how to actually unlock it is the mystery. But we know that if we do unlock it, it could be a game changer. And it's an example of, we as a society spend a lot of our resources, for example, subsidizing the fossil fuel industry, which is at the center of the climate problem. And we aren't spending nearly as many resources on, for instance, trying to develop that solution, even though we know if we are able to develop that solution, it could be an ecological game changer. So I think of fusion as, and look, I'm sure people who are listening to this, some people would say we're never going to get to fusion. And I would argue we haven't really made a real try of getting there in the way that we have made attempts to get to other things and achieved those things. I mean, obviously, the cliched example is the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project to develop fission energy and, the nuclear fission weapon. That was a major investment to get there, and science did deliver fission energy. We have not made a similar effort on fusion energy, so we haven't made the try that I think something like that and other clean technologies deserve. And it's not that we can't, it's that we've chosen not to, because we know we have enough resources at this point to make a much bigger attempt. We just politically and culturally haven't yet decided to do that. And I think that goes back to something in Don't Look Up. I just think the climate crisis is still not yet at the level in public awareness. It is physics-wise, it is as urgent as ever. But in the public awareness and how we devote our public budgets, it is not as urgent as the reality of the situation commands.
Yeah, so on the one hand, you have the people who say fusion will never happen. And then on the other hand, so I interviewed Malcolm Gladwell years ago. I was curious to hear what you think about this quote. This is what he told me. He says, "I don't call global warming a problem. It is a technical problem that will be solved. Really smart people like Elon Musk, who we've just been talking about, he and 1,000 other smart people, they're handling it. We should just get out of their way. Don't put impediments in their path. Let them do their thing." What do you think about that?
I think he's right that you obviously don't want to put impediments on people who are trying to solve the problem, sure. But I didn't hear the whole context of the interview, but where I guess I would take issue with that quote is, I also don't think just, hey, stay out of their way, let them do what they're going to do, and it'll solve itself. No, I don't agree with. I think that ultimately solving the climate crisis has already and will continue to come into conflict with the demand by oligarchs and corporations to make short-term profits. And I think that that where the public sector comes in has to be in encouraging and at times directing that public resources go into a focus on something longer term than just quarterly profits, a focus on something climate-wise that is a set of long-term solutions that don't have to focus on answering to shareholders every 90 days. And I think we can do that. I think it's just a matter of political will.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. All right. So unfortunately, this has been super fun, but we are unfortunately all out of time. So David, do you have any other projects you're working on or any other final thoughts?
Yeah, I would encourage people to go check out our website, The Lever. We do investigative journalism every day. It's at levernews.com. And I should, just as a preview, we have a major podcast documentary series coming out in the next few months called Master Plan, the first season of Master Plan. It's the story of how corruption was deliberately legalized in America over the last 50 years. And we're working really hard on it. There's a lot of incredible, never before heard, never before seen stuff in this project that we're doing. And I hope people will go check it out. You can Google it, Master Plan, Google The Lever, you'll find it. Okay, awesome. Yeah, definitely looking forward to that. All right, so we've been speaking with David Sirota about his book, Back to Our Future, his movie, Don't Look Up, and his podcast, Lever Time with David Sirota. So, David, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to David Sirota for joining us on the show. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please support us on Patreon over at patreon.com/geeks or via PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. Alright, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.